So, you're probably wondering if serving family style meals is the #1 thing that parents say diffuse battles at the table. Why are you now experiencing them? If you're new to serving meals family style, you may be having some family meal mishaps and some struggles with initial implementation and getting your kids on board with this new style of approach. Hopefully, you're seeing less resistance and some progress already if this is a new approach for your family. However, if you're not, I also want to go through some hiccups that we see happen traditionally when offering family style meals and to walk you through a bit more on what behaviors we want to make sure that we're promoting or avoiding or really using our own discernment on whether they're best practice approaches. The behaviors that we want to adopt, or rather those that we want to be normal parts of our feeding and eating environment for our families, are those that are listed here and also included throughout the Academy notebook for a few pages included in the Module 3 section. And those include things like trust. As a key tenet we talked about in Module 1 with the division of responsibility, trust is very important between a parent and child feeding relationship, but also for children to learn to trust their own bodies and their own intrinsic ability to self-regulate and eat according to their own internal motivations. Additionally, it's appropriate and advisable to be using guided choice to give your child age-appropriate options that are not so overwhelming or so open-ended that it creates more conflict or confusion over whose role it is to decide what, when, and where food is offered, but to still include and involve them in choices for meal planning, meal preparations, and meal times. Additionally, as we talked about in Module 2, structure and routine are very important and valuable behaviors to adopt, as is modeling, as we talked about in this module, with the family meal and the opportunity that family style meals offer us as adults to demonstrate our own healthy relationships with food, as well as how we behave and interact at meal times. Additionally, we want to be promoting enjoyable meals. We don't want to be restricting food or making it unavailable to our food in a way that compels them to feel like it's restricted. With meal and snack structure in family meals, this is not an attempt to manipulate or eliminate certain food choices from our children's diet, but instead some of the behaviors that we want to continue to use or begin using if we haven't previously been is to make sure that our children know that the foods that they prefer are both available to them and also accessible, and helping them understand what the boundaries and the limits are around such foods. And also, one of the last behaviors that we really want to ensure that we're adopting within this new feeding and eating environment is to make sure as much as we're able to involve our child. Anywhere from meal planning to grocery shopping to the preparation of a meal to the mealtime itself can be a really valuable opportunity to involve your child and get them hands-on with the food itself, but also just the togetherness that can happen, having time together in the kitchen or wherever you might find yourself preparing food. Some behaviors that we know to be counterproductive in the research when a family is trying to establish a division of responsibility in feeding include things like those behaviors shown on this slide. Behaviors like unstructured practice, whether that's a lack of structure in your routine and rhythms of the day or the routines and rhythms at the table specifically if your child has low structure when it comes to being seated and getting up from a table, and some of the challenges that we've talked about that can cause. Additionally, sometimes parents might be restricting their food. This may be done when you actually have a limited supply of food for any given reason, but not when used to manipulate the amount that your child might want to be eating. That would be considered more of a control tactic rather than an appropriate use of limited access to a given food. Additionally, sometimes we see that parents will pressure, as we've talked about again, especially in Module 1, parents might pressure their kids to eat a certain way, and this is a behavior we want to avoid. Instead, we want to be emphasizing pleasure at meals and in the mealtime environment, and sometimes that might come in the form of saying nothing rather than saying something, as in the wrong thing, that ruins pleasure and instead emphasizes pressure. Additionally, as discussed with the need to create a dessert policy, oftentimes threats or bribes can be used, and we create a dynamic around food where food is used as a reward, and that's not something that we want to be emphasizing when we're trying to cultivate eating competence for our families. As we review which behaviors to avoid, I also want to note that there is always opportunity to change. As I mentioned on the initial slide of this section, there are going to be mealtime mishaps that happen, but they don't have to be behaviors that become so ingrained in our family's new feeding environment that they completely derail us. Historically, they might have been used with good intent and instead backfired to create more issues at the table. However, moving forward, I want you to remember that we can always begin to shift towards the division of responsibility. As a responsive feeding style, we often learn as we go, and it's okay to be using behaviors only to later pause and reflect to see that wasn't our best practice approach. This might be based off what the evidence and the research itself says, or just through experiential learning as a parent as you begin to be a more responsive feeder to your unique child and where they thrive best in the feeding relationship. This is where we come to behaviors to use with caution. There are some behaviors that are shared in their research that may have a healthy, productive application within the feeding and eating environment. However, for some children, they may not be effective and instead might show and prove to be more counterproductive. Some things we might want to look at when we're trying to evaluate if it's a behavior we should be using or if we're using it the right way would be to evaluate what is your motivation in using such a behavior. If your motivation lies in getting your child to eat, that would be the wrong motivation. Even though, of course, we're all feeding our children with the intent of them to eat the food. However, oftentimes, whether it be a verbal or a kind of silent pressure being used through these different behaviors that we're going to address, sometimes that can derail the feeding and eating environment just as much, if not more, because it's an unidentified behavior that we're using as some of these overtly known behaviors that we want to avoid. Additionally, I'd encourage you to think through how the following behaviors are used with each kid in your family. If you only have one child, right now you can be responsive and identify which behaviors you feel are most healthy and effective for your child. However, each of us knows that as you add children to your family, if that's something that your family does, that our feeding approaches need to be responsive, and yet we can't feed each child differently and do so in a way that's stress-free, pressure-free, and positive for everyone. Oftentimes what happens when we use some of the behaviors listed here that are advised to use with caution is we use them differently for different children. So when we look at monitoring, for example, it's okay to monitor a child's overall intake and to monitor their overall growth to ensure that they are growing appropriately for their body type. What is inappropriate here and why this behavior would sometimes not be recommended would be if we're monitoring every single bite that a child eats for one of our children who maybe is smaller. The inverse could also be true of if we are excessively monitoring a child for how much they eat, if say they're a little bit larger on their growth curve. That would be inappropriate ways to use such a behavior, is that in a way that we aren't being consistent with that behavior across all children. We want to be feeding children regardless of their weight, and so we want to make sure that however we are feeding the child is to support our whole family unit as well as each individual child. Additionally, the behavior of encouragement can be called into question very easily because encouragement can be a form of pressure. We want to think about, are we encouraging our child in a way that's without consequence? Are we giving them this are we encouraging them in a way that offers and invites them to eat or participate in a certain way, or is it more being used as a demand? Additionally, how is your child responding to this? If you have, again, several or multiple children at multiple stages with different feeding temperaments, encouragement may be well received by one, but may not be well received by the other one, in which case you might find that using any form of encouragement at a meal is overall counterproductive and better avoided. Additionally, with praise, when we praise one child but not the other, it can send the other child who's not receiving that praise a message of lesser than, or that they're not measuring up, or that they're not pleasing you through their behavior at a meal. And while some of this behaviorally may make sense, when we tie such food parenting behaviors to our child's behavior at the table, it can send mixed messages and mixed understandings of their value and how well of an eater they are at a table when we praise with with a motive that maybe isn't universal to all kids. So again, I would encourage, if you are using praise, to be praising the process, as we talked about with some of the script suggestions before, rather than the person. This makes it a lot more neutral to praise any child in the family based off of more concrete behavior, such as, Ben, I like how you passed the bowl of peas. That's something that your other child could just as easily and just as neutrally be praised on, rather than, Ben, you did such a good job eating your peas, because that's something that holds so much more weight for the other child who may not have eaten their peas. Some other behaviors that I would advise you to use with caution can be things like nutrition education. Oftentimes as parents, we feel that we need to try and educate our children as much as possible about the nutrition in the foods that they eat. And yet oftentimes we don't even know how to do this as parents in a developmentally appropriate way. Instead, we're often using nutrition education as a way to try and manipulate or reason with our child or our children for why they should eat. We talk about concepts that really mean nothing to them, and often as parents even, you may have no understanding of what the nutritional side of this actually even means or the significance of it, and yet we try and use such nutrition lingo to perpetuate other objectives that we have to get our children to eat. Additionally, using nutrition education can often flow in with using reasoning and trying to add reasons for why our child should eat a certain food. However, if we pause, take a step back, and reflect on why we're using reasoning, we can see that we often would give reason for why our child should eat broccoli, but rarely do we give our child reason to eat a brownie. And just as the way we want to make sure that our food parenting behaviors are neutral between children in our family, we also want to make sure that our food parenting behaviors are neutral between the foods that we're offering. As we touched upon with the dessert policy, we want to be offering foods and showing our children a feeding environment where all foods can fit. And with this, oftentimes reasoning is misused in a way that is used for certain foods to almost suggest to our children that additional reasoning is needed in order to want to eat a given food, in this example broccoli, versus other foods that require no reason. And so again, this is just in the light of trying to neutralize all foods so that our children don't learn that one is good or bad, or that one is better than the other, or that one needs justification in order to want to eat it, rather than another food that just tastes good with zero justification. The last behavior that we'll review quickly here, and again, all of these are listed in the Academy notebook in greater detail, would be the behavior of negotiation. And this might be requiring your child to have 3 bites of a given item or an entire meal before they're able to be excused, or a requirement that they try everything on their plates, or a requirement of a no thank you bite. There's a lot of different negotiations that can happen at the table. Some parents will say that these are effective for their child, depending again on something that we'll talk about in Module 4, but depending on your child and your child's feeding temperament, sometimes negotiation can work productively for a child without putting the mealtime environment or the feeding and eating environment at risk. So if you're able to suggest to your child, you need to at least try everything on your plate. For some children, that may not be a problem. For other children, that might automatically compel them to have a very anxious response to even coming to the table, because they know the expectation is that they have to try everything. And that might be a very challenging process for a child. So again, you know your child best. You are able to read their responses better than anyone, or better than I'm able to, through teaching this module as a pre-recording. But it's important for you to recognize, is this negotiation tactic effective for your child, or is it interfering with your ability to have a positive, pressure-free feeding and eating environment? Again, is this negotiation tactic also something that you can use neutrally across every member of your family, rather than just with one, and yet it maybe shuts down the appetite or the involvement at a meal with another child, in which case then you would be better off probably not using negotiation as your main tactic. As we begin to wrap up Module 3, I wanted to go back to this quote that I shared earlier in the last section, because I know some of you might be thinking to yourself, yeah, but we're not enjoying time at the table, and we're still having a lot of challenges, even with us adopting the behaviors that we're supposed to be doing and avoiding the behaviors that are listed as counterproductive with the division of responsibility, and yet my child continues to be fighting for control or misbehave at meal times. What am I supposed to do now? And I know that we can't cover every potential meal mishap within the context of this module, but I want to give some common examples of challenges that families face in the case that they might be helpful to a situation that you're dealing with. Something that I often hear when families start to try family style meals is, yeah, we tried family style meals and it just didn't work for us. And so something I want to go ahead and review here as we wrap up Module 3 is to some of the pushback or the challenges that you might find with your child limit testing as you begin to use family style meals, so that you don't give up prematurely. Family style meals do not have to be done every meal of every day. They do have an effective place as part of your overall feeding environment and feeding approach. However, what I don't want to see is that rather than using them as a part of your family's meal and snack structure and routine and the rhythms that you use for your family's feeding and eating environment, what I don't want to see is that you just stop using them altogether prematurely because of some of this pushback that you face. Instead, as I've emphasized several times throughout this module, I would encourage you within the confines of the family meal to pause and reflect on what's going on so that we can find more productive and positive ways to address what's going on and not just kind of escape it with an alternative approach. So some of the potential scenarios that we might see take place, and this might be happening in the family feeding environment that you already have, or just kind of pick up or peak a little bit more as you begin using a family style meal. Oftentimes what can happen is as a child sees that a change is taking place, the child is going to test the limits and check how firm the boundaries are and how consistent you as the parent are in what your role is for the division of responsibility and your role of what, when, and where food is offered. So if a child is used to you acting in such a way, especially if they're 4 or 5 or 8 or 10 or 15 years old, you can quickly see how there's been several years in their systems to wire them to assume that you're going to either present meals in a certain way or react to meals in a certain way based off of the experiences that they have historically. And so it might take some time for us to rewire their brains a little bit and set new neural pathways for how they begin to associate meals happen and how they begin to appreciate and see the mealtime, the meal environment starting to look for your family. So all of these, I'm just putting this as a precedence to let you know that all of these are very normal, but they're also ones that are very workable. So please don't give up too soon on including family style meals as part of your family's feeding and eating environment, just based off of the initial struggle that these scenarios might present for your family. So getting into each one, considering how your child might be fighting over what is offered. Historically, if you had a family meal where you pre-plated them something separate of what you or your spouse maybe was eating, your child might up front be really vocal about that they don't like what you're giving them because you used to only give them one food and now you're trying something different. A few things you can kind of think through if this is a challenge for you is, again, having your script suggestion in your back pocket. So as soon as your child says this, we're not answering in a reactive way, but instead we're giving a very calm, confident response of, I'm sorry you don't like what's on the menu tonight. This is what we're having tonight. Or I'm sorry you don't like what we're having on the menu tonight. You don't have to eat it. Or if they push back saying, I wanted mac and cheese, because say maybe they're used to mac and cheese every single night, you might remind them, I'm sorry, mac and cheese isn't on the menu tonight. I'd be happy to have it with you this weekend. And give them, as I've said before, to be able to defer their request to another time, keeping it within the boundaries of what is being offered. Another way you might do this that we talked about though at the beginning is making sure that you're doing something that you see your family being as successful with as possible. If the family meal suggestions that are in each week of the modules aren't aligning well for your family or creating too much resistance for your family, you might look at how you can take a step back and incorporate some new concept or some new food into the family meals that you're already offering, but still making sure that there's plenty of preferred foods available. So an example of this might be with the mac and cheese. If your child is used to having mac and cheese every night and the only thing that you give them is mac and cheese and an applesauce pouch because you know those are both Love-It foods, it might be a big switch to then go offer roasted salmon, roasted potatoes, and roasted broccoli. Maybe especially if none of those are preferred foods for your child. Instead, what you might do is you might offer roasted broccoli, roasted salmon, and mac and cheese and applesauce pouches. That would be a completely acceptable family style meal. You could put it out in this way. You can still present it and position your feeding environment in the same way of a family style meal, but instead of having a roasted potato and all non-preferred foods, you're incorporating those elements that they are very comfortable with, that they consider very safe foods for them, and yet you're starting to shift it into a new norm for your feeding environment. So if your child's really resisting coming to the table or feels that you've, stripped them of all the foods that they enjoy, things like that, it might merit you taking a little bit of a step back and not going at it quite so assertively. Some kids, need smaller steps so they can see the connection of how things were and what worked before with where your family is going. And that might help you too to have less stress at a meal because your child's not pushing back quite so much because they see that preferred food available. Moving along to family style meals, and if you're passing the element or if you're serving them just from the center of the table, sometimes children can take too much without eating it. So again, setting very clear expectations from the beginning and remaining consistent with those expectations before your child begins to cross the line. If your child is testing the limits, they'll probably test them to see, are you going to support that this is a firm boundary, that this is the way we do things. Going back to some of the script suggestions given earlier, things like saying we want everyone to pass and have their first helping, and once everyone has had a chance to have some, you're welcome to have more. Also mentioned before is things like addressing the scarcity aspect. Is it that your child is just limit testing and wants to see, are they going to get a rise out of mom or dad if they take a heaping scoop of something? Or do you stay neutral? Do you remind them what the boundary is? Or do you react and start telling them to put it back and change again that tone of the family style meal and the feeding environment? Additionally, kids might wonder if there's enough. They might feel that they need to eat really fast or that they need to hoard the food very quickly in order for there to be enough of it. So again, you can use script suggestions and have those in your back pocket and use those that are shared throughout the Academy notebook to be able to remind your child that there will be enough and set either proper expectations. If there's not enough for everyone to say have 2 or 3 of something, then make that known up front so they know that they're not being restricted, but that's just the amount that's available that night. Additionally, letting them know when there is more of something. If it seems like this continues to be a problem at the family style meal, again, you might choose to pause, reflect, take a step back, and see, maybe I should be putting out more shredded cheese on taco night because every time it seems to create a rise in the kids because there's not enough for them to have their fill. You want to deem what's appropriate for your family's food budget, for your family's feeding preferences, and the options that you're offering. Say with the initial example of roasted broccoli, roasted salmon, macaroni, and applesauce pouches, you might decide we're not going to have multiple applesauce pouches at the family style meal, but you might decide I could make an extra box of mac and cheese though, because it seems like they're fighting over the amount every time we do it this way. So again, just take these as learning opportunities. Take this as an opportunity for you to continue to develop your responsiveness in how you feed and to see how this pushback at one meal does not mean that you did anything wrong or that your child is intentionally trying to behave poorly, but you two together are just learning how to reshape what your feeding environment is with some of these stressors that come up understandably and naturally in changing the feeding environment. Additionally, things like when desserts are always eaten first. Oftentimes when I encourage families to begin offering desserts with the family meal, the number one concern that comes up with parents is that the child ate the dessert first. And they might initially, and they might always. That might be their feeding temperament, that they prefer to eat it first, and then they usually begin to eat the rest of the meal. But again, I would encourage you to see this as potential limit testing. So remain calm and stay confident. If your child eats their dessert first, they may be watching or wondering, is my parent going to react to this? Are my parents going to take back what they said about I can eat it whenever I want at the meal and not make an issue of it? Is my parent going to then make me eat broccoli because I already ate my brownie? And so your child is likely watching for what you're doing and how you and your partner or whatever caretakers are involved in the family meal environment, how you're responding to the choices that they're making, whether it be loading up heaping piles of something on their plate or eating dessert first. So again, I would remind you to stay neutral. It does not matter if they eat their brownie first. Initially, some children, not all children, but some children might only eat their brownie at dinner. Well, I encourage you to think through this from a different angle of they might have only eaten their brownie anyways. And so you could have offered them the family meal and they barely ate it, but you were using the brownie as the bargaining chip to try and get them to eat. As a parent, of course, we feel better if our child eats more than just a brownie for dinner. But again, the power that we give the brownie when we use it as the bargaining chip being offered after a meal, at the meal itself, can be really confusing and conflicting for a child. So instead, offer milk with the meal, let them eat their brownie, and let them have a few times of practicing this. And I would encourage you to give it a few times before you or your partner jump to conclusions that it's not working, because the majority of kids will begin to shift to then eat other foods. And instead of the brownie holding all this power over the meal and clearly being so much more pleasurable than the original meal itself because it was having to be used as this bribe, instead, oftentimes what will happen is your child will begin eating the other components of the meal because their eating begets more eating. They begin eating other elements of their meal because, again, the tone and the environment is so much different than it used to be that now they realize they got to fully enjoy the brownie at their pleasure, at their will, as part of the family meal, and then move on to other components without anyone mentioning anything. And so again, give all of this a few times to try it out and see how it goes, while also knowing where to remain consistent and remain calm and see how your child learns how to work it out for themselves. Moving on to taking only the same things, sometimes, going back to the example of cheese, sometimes, say on taco night, your child might only take cheese and chips. This would be a very common scenario where families would say, well, at least before I got them to eat a veggie quesadilla because I made it and I put it on their plate and they knew that they had to eat it. Where now that they have the choices of a family style meal and a build your own taco type option, now they're only taking the same things. And that could be the case again initially. Chances are, especially at the beginning, they're testing you. They want to know, are you going to remain calm and consistent with that you said you're not going to make them eat certain things or in certain ways with how they involve themselves at the family meal or what they take at the family meal. And so we'll talk in future modules about how you can start to try and promote more variety in their diet. But for the time being, and for this module specifically, I want you to really think through how this might shift the feeding environment if you start to approach it in different ways. If you start to try and push different things on your child, it might quickly change the tone and call into question for them, is my parent really for real about this, or are they going to switch it up on me and go back to old ways with some of the behaviors that were used? Instead, things like a family meal tend to promote more choice and more variety because you're encouraging them to, let's pass the elements. You don't have to eat it, but I'd like for everyone to have it on their plate. Again, if your child pushes back, don't keep pushing. This does not need to be a power struggle, but if they know you don't have to eat it, but here, you can have a little muffin cup, like a little muffin tin liner as your learning it cup, and that's a perfectly acceptable place to put all your learning it foods. And maybe your child learns there's a safe place that's a little bit outside of their space that they're allowed to put some of those foods that they're not quite ready to have in their main space or on their main plate in a way that makes them feel as though they need to eat it. Something like that can kind of be used as a helpful transition, or a learning it plate on the side of their plate for the foods that maybe they don't want to eat yet, but that they're encouraged to at least take and have on their plate or on their learning it plate. That can also be a helpful transitional tool until your child's willing to take more of all the elements of the meal on their actual plate. Additionally, moving on with this is if your child still doesn't try anything new. And again here, as I continue to say, remain consistent and keep going. It might take several times and several exposures for your child to begin to want to learn any new food, let alone all the new foods that you're going to be starting to offer to them, and that's okay. they need time, and they need to know that they have space and that they have permission to take time and learn to like these foods at their pace. So if they still aren't trying anything new, don't worry too much about that right now, because again, right now our emphasis and our focus and priorities is on creating a positive, pleasurable place for everyone to be in the family feeding and eating environment, rather than to try and get our child to eat anything. Something that comes up every round of the academy is this of hard situations in other people's homes. We can implement a our house, our rules policy if that fits for your family when you're within the confines and context of your home. But something that constantly comes up, whether it be from the very opinionated or deeply ingrained Italian in-laws or an aunt who's always aware of the next best diet, has a very big tendency to kind of fall into the fat-phobic diet culture that tends to be around us. We can't always control those around us and how they choose to feed not only themselves, but how they approach food in general and the kind of feeding environment that they have in place in their domains, whether this be at their house or in school settings or in other social situations. Some of the most common situations that come up as challenging to us as parents and knowing how to navigate is things like when people say, if you eat this, then you can have this. And again, using food as a bargaining chip, or making food very transactional, as if you have to eat one in order to earn or get the other. Other things like often it's very socially normal for there to be desserts offered after dinner, especially at different celebrations or large gatherings and things like that. But that can quickly, again, be turned into something that makes the dinner meal a little bit more challenging if the dessert is being used as kind of a weighted bargaining chip for the dinner meal itself. Also, many families were born and raised with the Clean Plate Club, and it's very challenging for particularly older generations, or those of us who are raised by the people of older generations, to consider a meal over if our plate is not clear. That can be a big challenge in different people's feeding environments. Otherwise, sometimes people too can have just really unhealthy options in their house. And as families often call it, their other people's houses are full of pure crap. And we don't really want our child eating anything that's available in those places. And that can be a challenge too. Additionally, if your child, has a situation where there's nothing at this particular opportunity to eat, that there's nothing that they would eat. Or it might be that there's a situation where a family member or a friend is very focused on the quantity of food eaten. It might be that someone is very vocal or aware of how much your child eats or how little your child eats. Either one of these can be a challenge for you as the parent to navigate, particularly if it's expressed in front of your child. Additionally, things like inappropriate language can be such a challenge because we can't always just put earmuffs on our children to help them avoid hearing some of these remarks that are made about food or body image or diets and different dynamics of eating that other people might struggle with themselves in their own relationship with foods, but again, gets projected on our children in other people's feeding environments. So while I know we will talk through each of these more specifically through different questions that come up in the live component of the Q&A, and I would love to spend more time on each of these specifically, I want to instead move forward to kind of think about how we can handle these hard situations in other people's home in a more high-level overview. So no matter what the scenario that plays out is, or no matter what the different dynamic is in someone else's feeding environment, that you feel a little bit more calm and confident in terms of how to handle it, whether it fits into one of these ones or not. Some questions to ask yourself and reflect on, hopefully ideally away from the actual situation itself, in order to help you better understand the best, most proactive way to handle these hard situations, might be to ask yourself some of these questions. How often is your child exposed to it? I often encourage families that if this is a once a year person that your child is surrounded by at a single holiday event, that they aren't necessarily as influenced by in the feeding environment, then it may not be a situation that you even really care to tackle. It might be something that's bothersome to you in the moment that you need to kind of learn how to deal with at that one-off feeding opportunity each year, but maybe it's not one that's even worth the battle. However, the opposite is true of if this is someone who your child spends considerable amount of time with, or maybe a family member who watches your child once a week or several times a week, it would merit a more productive conversation to hopefully be had so that you could feel on the same page as this person. And part of this is thinking through, how big is the influence of this person on your child. It may be a very important person to them, but someone they're around very little, or it might be someone who they're around very often, and this can somewhat compete with the feeding approach that you yourself are using within your family's feeding environment if they're around this person more often. You can still make progress with using the division of responsibility yourself, but it can help you to think through how much you need to address it and what capacity you need to address it with that person, depending on how often your child's exposed to that person or that situation. Additionally, considering, is your child the target of it? Sometimes people will say things around our children that drive us crazy, and we don't agree with at all, and yet what their comments and their perspectives, particularly about like food or body image or things like that, may not at all be related to our child. Maybe they're even speaking it about themselves, and our child just catches wind of it and hears it and maybe comes to us with questions about what this particular family or friend was saying. However, if the comments aren't directed to the child, that again takes a little less of the threat from it being something that could shape your child's own relationship with food more significantly. Also, if you're able to begin identifying what the core belief or value is at hand, oftentimes with some of the feeding behaviors that we've talked about and how we address different food-related anxieties and insecurities, or our own lack of eating competence, as in Module 1, if we can identify some of the core values that others might have and why they're subjecting our families to those, can help us to come at the conversation with a little bit more understanding. So sometimes things like if it's a family, as I mentioned, with deep Italian roots, and a family gathering every Sunday of a spaghetti dinner is very important to this set of grandparents, you can kind of start to think through where is their value system around food, and what does the feeding environment mean to them, and what do they consider a meal versus maybe some of the adaptations and expectations that your family is starting to use in order to not pressure your child to eat. And so if you take a step back and you look at kind of the core values of that person that you might find yourself or your feeding approach in conflict with, it can help the conversation go a little bit more productively. Additionally, with this example specifically, you could even look at, are you or your partner the best person to be having a conversation when you decide it's appropriate to initiate a conversation? If it's your in-laws, it might be more appropriate for your partner to initiate the conversation, or you might find that it's something that you in private with whoever pertains to the situation can have a more productive conversation with. And also to think through, what do you really want to get out of the conversation? Because we don't want to just be stirring the pot, particularly if it's at a table or something like that, if we don't really know what our main goal coming out of it is and how we want things to be different after the conversation. So if before you go into these hard situations, you can kind of think to yourself and ask yourself and talk with your partner about, how do we want things to look different after this conversation? What do we want to get out of this? This isn't a we win, they lose type dynamic, but this is a, how do we want the tone to be different for our child? Or how do we want this environment to impact our child and our overall family's experience at this gathering or this social situation to be different than what it is now? It might be that grandparents are forcing your kid to clean their plate, and that is stressing your child out and completely overwhelming them, so much so that they might not even want to go to these type gatherings. Well, you might decide that really what you hope to get out of this and how you hope things for it to be different is that they would just accept your child to, try everything on the plate, but not eat everything. Again, that might not be an expectation that's even appropriate for your child, you know your child's feeding temperament and what's going to work in terms of making those types of negotiations, even in hard situations like this. It also might mean that you bring a preferred food and you just say, if it's important to you that they join us for the entire family meal, may we bring something to contribute each week. And you bring something that's comfortable for your child and that you know that they can be successful with, and while still learning some of the other dynamics and eating competence skills that come with that overall social situation. It might be that you just put one bite worth of food on their plate, and so if the goal is that they leave with a clean plate, there's a lot less food for them to get through, and thus a lot less of the meal, with everyone perseverating on how much food this child still has to eat. So evaluating each of these situations with the lens of some of these questions can really help you hone in on what's most important and what will be most productive moving forward once you've had a chance to have this conversation. So when it comes time to actually respond to these situations, again, in an ideal world, I don't typically recommend that you respond at the moment it first happens. If there's an appropriate opportunity to say something that you feel comfortable and calm in doing so, you're more than welcome to. However, if this is something, again, that you think is going to come up again and again, I tend to encourage families, and tend myself, to lean more towards taking a moment to ask some of those questions on the last slide and reflecting a little bit more about what my key objectives are in having the conversation, so that when I do go into the conversation, I'm more able to touch on the key points that are actually going to help perpetuate a more positive, pressure-free feeding environment in those situations moving forward. So assuming that you've had a little bit of time to kind of ask yourself some questions and think through some of the points that you want to either ask or that you either want to share, here's a few things that might be helpful in responding. Again, knowing the key productive points that you want to have. Also, blaming me. I think it's completely appropriate to share with a family or with friends, hey, we're trying something new with XYZ, whatever it might be, with how much our child eats or how we approach meals or whatever you feel like is kind of the meat of the matter. And you can just say, we're trying something new with how Ben eats, and we would really appreciate it if you would support it and defer to us on how to feed. Just say it as simply as that, the same way that you would ask people to respect the way you approach naps or discipline or other things. Know that you can confidently go about feeding your child no different. You get to ultimately have the say. However, they might or might not be receptive to this. They may or may not change the way they approach things in these environments, in which case your family and you have to decide how you feel most comfortable proceeding. Sometimes if people are receptive, just a little hesitant and unsure on what you're talking about, particularly with things that stem from the division of responsibility that may seem very counterintuitive to people, such as your child doesn't have to eat what you offer, your job is just what, when, and where to offer. That can be very unfamiliar and very foreign to people who have no understanding of this feeding approach. If it's someone who's going to be feeding your child often, and they're open to learning more about it, you might offer them resources so that they can educate themselves or learn a little bit more on the topics that you're sharing with them. You also might prepare your child to know what type of expectations to have at these people's houses. Going back to the grandparents' example of a big spaghetti dinner every Sunday, it can be helpful for you to share with your child, in our house and in our immediate family, this is the way we do things, and remind them what their job is and what your job is. But then share with them, but when we go to grandma and grandpa's, XYZ, and share with them what the expectations are. Again, hopefully you've had some time to get to the real meat of the matter with whatever family members or friends that might be, so that you understand what those core values are and you can convey those to your kids in a way that sets up expectations, but also helps them understand some of the reasoning why other people do things differently. If you want to simplify it as much as possible, you can also just remind your child, in our house, this is the way we do things. In other people's houses, they do things differently. And when we're in other people's houses, we're going to respect their rules and do our best to respond the way they ask us to. And again, you can help decide in those situations, if these people are not responsive to your requests, you can decide how you and your partner or your child or your family as a whole decides to step away from those situations, or maybe have an escape tactic if you feel it gets really inappropriate and it exceeds what you're willing to have as part of a mealtime environment that your child and your family is exposed to. So now as we wrap up, I just want to leave you with this final thought, which will help tee us up into Module 4, where we talk a little bit more about your child's feeding temperament and kind of this concept of how picky is your child and where they fall on what we might call a picky eating continuum. And that really comes from where we want to begin to evaluate what we've worked on over the last 3 weeks. And over the last 3 modules, everything regarding our child's feeding and eating and our family's feeding and eating foundation. With consistency, you should begin to see that the power struggles and the behavioral issues that your child might have historically had with mealtimes begin to less. You should start to experience less mealtime stress and more feeding success as you set up this feeding and eating foundation to align more closely with a division of responsibility. However, kids will be kids, so we do need to keep in mind that when feeding a small army, it's probably never going to necessarily be easy. However, when we address the components that we've talked about over the last 3 modules, we should begin to see a drastic reduction in this stress, a drastic reduction in the stress at and around mealtimes. And if we're not seeing that, we need to begin also considering, is there anything else at play? Is there any other component that we're missing to add a piece to the puzzle that helps us more holistically look at how we can feed and support our child? However, since this wraps us up on the first half of the Academy, being on the feeding and eating foundation, I want you to really focus on what the first 3 modules have been trying to emphasize and establish within your family's feeding dynamic, and that being the division of responsibility, routine and structure, and using family style meals as a technique to help compel your child and your family to have less stressful meal times. In the second half of the module, we will continue to work on strategies and giving you additional tools to help add variety and help focus on kind of the what of food is being offered. But right now, our goal is really to truly emphasize the foundation so that you have such a great canvas and a strong underlying support to begin building this feeding relationship off of. However, if you still feel that you have struggles that have not been addressed and maybe need to be addressed before we dive into what your child can or cannot eat, I want to encourage you to check in for Module 4 as we begin looking at the picky eating continuum and how some of the behavioral challenges that we've talked about aren't necessarily best satisfied through just behavioral intervention, but rather things that we need to address from a more sensory standpoint and understanding a little bit more of your child as a whole child and not just some of these behavioral techniques and strategies.